Chapter 5. Caspian's Adventure in the Mountains. After this, Caspian and his tutor had many more secret conversations on the top of a great tower, and at each conversation Caspian learned more about old Narnia, so that thinking and dreaming about the old days, and longing that they might come back, filled nearly all his spare hours. But of course he'd not that many hours to spare, for now his education was beginning in earnest. He learned sword fighting and riding, swimming and diving, how to shoot with a bow and play on the recorder and the theorbo, how to hunt the stag and cut him up when he was dead, besides cosmography, rhetoric, heraldry, versification, and of course history with a little law, physics, alchemy, and astronomy. Of magic he learned only the theory, for Dr. Cornelius said the practical part was not a proper study for princes, and I myself am only a very imperfect magician, and can do only the smallest experiments. Of navigation, which is a noble and heroical art, he was taught nothing, because King Myraz disapproved of ships and the sea. He also learned a great deal by using his own eyes and ears. As a little boy he'd often wondered why he disliked his aunt, Queen Punaprismia. He now saw that it was because she disliked him. He also began to see that Narnia was an unhappy country. The taxes were high, and the laws were stern, and Myraz was a cruel man. After some years, there came a time when the Queen seemed to be ill, and there was a great deal of bustle and bother about her in the castle, and doctors came, and courtiers whispered. This was in early summer-time, and one night, while all this fuss was going on, Caspian was unexpectedly wakened by Dr. Cornelius after he'd only been a few hours in bed. "Are we going to do a little astronomy, Doctor?" "Hush! Trust me, and do exactly as I tell you. Put on all your clothes. You have a long journey before you." Caspian was very surprised, but he had learned to have confidence in his tutor, and he began doing what he was told at once. When he was dressed, the doctor said, "I have a wallet for you. We must go to the next room and fill it with victuals from your Highness's supper table. My gentlemen in waiting will be there. They are fast asleep and will not wake. I am a very minor magician, but I can at least contrive a charm to sleep." They went into the antechamber, and there, sure enough, the two gentlemen in waiting were, sprawling on chairs and snoring hard. Dr. Cornelius quickly cut up the remains of a cold chicken and some slices of venison, and put them, with bread and an apple or so, and a little flask of good wine, into the wallet which he gave to Caspian. It fitted on a strap over Caspian's shoulder, like a satchel you would use for taking books to school. "Have you your sword?" "Yes." "Then put this mantle over all, to hide the sword and the wallet. That's right. And now we must go to the great tower and talk." When they reached the top of the tower, it was a cloudy night, not at all like the night when they had seen the conjunction of Tarver and Alambil. Dr. Cornelius said, "Dear Prince, you must leave this castle at once, and go to seek your fortune in the wide world. Your life is in danger here." "Why?" "Because you are the true king of Narnia, Caspian the 10th, the true son and heir of Caspian the 9th. Long life to your majesty." And suddenly, to Caspian's great surprise, the little man dropped down on one knee and kissed his hand. "What does it all mean? I don't understand." "I wonder you have never asked me before. Why, being the son of King Caspian, you are not King Caspian yourself. Everyone except your majesty knows that Myraz is a usurper. When he first began to rule, he did not even pretend to be the king. He called himself Lord Protector. But then your royal mother died, a good queen, and the only Telmarine who was ever kind to me. And then, one by one, all the great lords who had known your father died or disappeared. Not by accident, either. Myraz weeded them out. Belisar and Euvelus, they were shot with arrows on a hunting party. By chance, it was pretended. All the great house of the Passerids he sent to fight giants on the northern frontier, till one by one they fell. Arlian and Erimon and a dozen more he executed for treason on a false charge. The 2 brothers of Beaver's Dam he shut up as madmen. And finally he persuaded the 7 noble lords, who alone among all the Telmarines did not fear the sea, to sail away and look for new lands beyond the Eastern Ocean. And as he intended, they never came back. And when there was no one left who could speak a word for you, then his flatterers, as he had instructed them, begged him to become king. And of course he did. Do you mean he now wants to kill me too? That is almost certain. But why now? I mean, why didn't he do it long ago if he wanted to? What harm have I done him? He has changed his mind about you because of something that happened only 2 hours ago. The Queen has had a son. I don't see what that's got to do with it. Don't see? Have all my lessons in history and politics taught you no more than that? Listen. As long as he had no children of his own, he was willing enough that you should become king after he died. He may not have cared much about you, but he would rather you have the throne than a stranger. But now he has a son of his own. He will want his own son to be the next king. You are in the way. He'll clear you out of the way. Is he really as bad as that? Would he really murder me? He murdered your father. Caspian felt very queer and said nothing. I can tell you the whole story, but not now. There is no time. We must fly at once. You'll come with me? Oh, I dare not. It would make your danger greater. 2 are more easily tracked than 1. Dear Prince, dear King Caspian, you must be very brave. You must go alone and at once. Try to get across the southern border to the court of King Nain of Archenland. He will be good to you. Shall I ever see you again? I hope so, dear Prince. What friend have I in the wide world except your Majesty? And I have a little magic. But in the meantime, speed is everything. Here are 2 gifts before you go. This is a little purse of gold. Alas, all the treasure in the castle should be yours by rights. And here is something far better. He put in Caspian's hands something which he could hardly see, but which he knew by the feel. That is the greatest and most sacred treasure of Narnia. Many terrors I endured, many spells did I utter to find it when I was still young. It is the magic horn of Queen Susan herself, which she left behind her when she vanished from Narnia at the end of the Golden Age. It is said that whoever blows it shall have strange help. No one can say how strange. It may have the power to call Queen Lucy and King Edmund and Queen Susan and the High King Peter back from the past, and they will set all to rights. It may be that it will call up Aslan himself. Take it, King Caspian, but do not use it except at your greatest need. And now, haste, haste, haste. The little door at the very bottom of the tower, the door into the garden, is unlocked. There we must part. Can I get my horse, Destria? He is already saddled and waiting for you just at the corner of the orchard. During the long climb down the winding staircase, Cornelius whispered many more words of direction and advice. Caspian's heart was sinking, but he tried to take it all in. Then came the fresh air of the garden, a fervent hand-clasp with the doctor, a run across the lawn, a welcoming whinny from Destria, and so King Caspian X left the castle of his fathers. Looking back, he saw fireworks going up to celebrate the birth of the new prince. All night he rode southward, choosing byways and bridle paths through woods as long as he was in country that he knew. But afterwards he kept to the high road. Destria was as excited as his master at this unusual journey, and Caspian, though tears had come into his eyes at saying goodbye to Dr. Cornelius, felt brave and, in a way, happy to think that he was King Caspian, riding to seek adventures, with his sword on his left hip and Queen Susan's magic horn on his right. But when day came with a sprinkle of rain, and he looked about him and saw on every side unknown woods, wild heaths and blue mountains. He thought how large and strange the world was, and felt frightened and small. As soon as he was in full daylight, he left the road and found an open grassy place amid a wood where he could rest. He took off Destria's bridle and let him graze, ate some cold chicken and drank a little wine, and presently fell asleep. It was late afternoon when he awoke. He ate a morsel and continued his journey, still southward, by many unfrequented lanes. He was now in a land of hills, going up and down, but always more up than down. From every ridge he could see the mountains growing bigger and blacker ahead. As evening closed in, he was riding their lower slopes. The wind rose. Soon rain fell in torrents. Destria became uneasy. There was thunder in the air. And now they entered a dark and seemingly endless pine forest, and all the stories Caspian had ever heard of trees being unfriendly to men crowded into his mind. He remembered that he was, after all, a Telmarine, one of a race that cut down trees wherever they could, and were at war with all wild things. And though he himself might be unlike other Telmarines, the trees could not be expected to know that. Nor did they. The wind became a tempest. The woods roared and creaked all round them. There came a crash. A tree fell right across the road just behind him. "Quiet, Destria, quiet," said Caspian, patting his horse's neck. But he was trembling himself, and knew that he had escaped death by an inch. Lightning flashed, and a great crack of thunder seemed to break the sky in two just overhead. Destria bolted in good earnest. Caspian was a good rider, but he had not the strength to hold him back. He kept his seat, but he knew that his life hung by a thread during the wild career that followed. Tree after tree rose up before him in the dusk, and was only just avoided. Then, almost too suddenly to hurt, and yet it did hurt him too, something struck Caspian on the forehead, and he knew no more. When he came to himself, he was lying in a firelit place with bruised limbs and a bad headache. Low voices were speaking close at hand. "And now, before it wakes up, we must decide what to do with it." "Kill it! We can't let it live. It would betray us." "We ought to have killed it at once then, or else let it alone. We can't kill it now, not after we've taken it in and bandaged its head and all. It would be murdering a guest." "Gentlemen," said Caspian in a feeble voice, "whatever you do to me, I hope you will be kind to my poor horse." "Your horse has taken flight long before we found you." "Now don't let it talk you round with its pretty words. I still say horns and halibuts. Of course we're not going to murder it, for shame, Knickerbrick. What do you say, Truffle Hunter? What shall we do with it?" "I shall give it a drink." A dark shape approached the bed. Caspian felt an arm slipped gently under his shoulders. If it was exactly an arm. The shape somehow seemed wrong. The face that bent towards him seemed wrong too. He got the impression that it was very hairy and very long-nosed, and there were odd white patches on each side of it. "It's a mask of some sort. Or perhaps I'm in a fever and imagining it." A cupful of something sweet and hot was set to his lips, and he drank. At that moment one of the others poked the fire. A blaze sprang up, and Caspian almost screamed with the shock as the sudden light revealed the face that was looking into his own. It was not a man's face, but a badger's, though larger and friendlier and more intelligent than the face of any badger he had seen before. And it had certainly been talking. He saw, too, that he was on a bed of heather in a cave. By the fire sat two little bearded men, so much wilder and shorter and hairier and thicker than Dr. Cornelius that he knew at once they were real dwarfs, ancient dwarfs, with not a drop of human blood in their veins. And Caspian knew that he had found the old Narnians at last. Then his head began to swim again. In the next few days he learned to know them by name. The badger was called Truffle Hunter. He was the oldest and kindest of the three. The dwarf who had wanted to kill Caspian was a sour black dwarf. That is, his hair and beard were black and thick and hard like horsehair. His name was Knickerbrick. The other dwarf was a red dwarf, with hair rather like a fox's, and he was called Trumpkin. "And now," said Knickerbrick, on the first evening when Caspian was well enough to sit up and talk, "we still have to decide what to do with this human. You two think you've done it a great kindness by not letting me kill it. But I suppose the upshot is that we have to keep it prisoner for life. I'm certainly not going to let it go alive, to go back to its own kind and betray us all. Bulbs and bolsters, Knickerbrick, said Trumpkin. Why need you talk so unhandsomely? It isn't a creature's fault that it bashed its head against a tree outside our hole. I don't think it looks like a traitor. I say, you haven't yet found out whether I want to go back. I don't. I want to stay with you, if you let me. I've been looking for people like you all my life. Well, that's a likely story. You're a Telmarine and a human, aren't you? Of course you want to go back to your own kind. Well, even if I did, I couldn't. I was flying for my life when I had my accident. The king wants to kill me. If you'd killed me, you'd have done the very thing to please him.
Well, now, you don't say so.
Huh? Said Trumpkin. What's that? What have you been doing, human, to fall foul of Myraz at your age? He's my uncle, began Caspian, when Knickerbrick jumped up with his hand on his dagger. There you are! Not only a Telmarine, but close kin and heir to our greatest enemy. Are you still mad enough to let this creature live? He would have stabbed Caspian then and there, if the Badger and Trumpkin had not got in the way and forced him back to his seat and held him down. Now, once and for all, Knickerbrick, will you contain yourself, or must Truffle Hunter and I sit on your head? Knickerbrick sulkily promised to behave, and the other two asked Caspian to tell his whole story. When he had done so, there was a moment's silence. "Oh, that's the queerest thing I ever heard. I don't like it. I didn't know there were stories about us told among the humans still. The less they know about us, the better. That old nurse, now, she'd better have held her tongue. And it's all mixed up with that tutor, a renegade dwarf. I hate 'em. I hate 'em worse than the humans. You mark my words. No good will come of this."
"Don't you go talking about things you don't understand, Knickerbrick," said Truffle Hunter. "You dwarfs are as forgetful and changeable as the humans themselves. I'm a beast, I am, and a badger what's more. We don't change. We hold on. I say great good will come of it. This is the true king of Narnia we've got here. A true king coming back to true Narnia. And we beasts remember, even if dwarfs forget, that Narnia was never right, except when a son of Adam was king."
"Whistles and whirligigs, Truffle Hunter. You don't mean to say you want to give the country to humans?"
"I said nothing about that. It's not men's country. Who should know that better than me? But it is a country for a man to be king of. We badgers have long enough memories to know that. Why, bless us all, wasn't the High King Peter a man?"
"Do you believe all those old stories?"
"I tell you we don't change, we beasts. We don't forget. I believe in the High King Peter and the rest that reigned at Cape Paravel, as firmly as I believe in Aslan himself."
As firmly as that, I dare say. But who believes in Aslan nowadays?" "I do," said Caspian. "And if I hadn't believed in him before, I would now. Back there among the humans, the people who laughed at Aslan would have laughed at stories about talking beasts and dwarfs. Sometimes I did wonder if there really was such a person as Aslan. But then sometimes I wondered if there were really people like you. Yet there you are."
"That's right. You're right, King Caspian. And as long as you will be true to old Narnia, you shall be my king. Whatever they say. Long life to your majesty."
"You make me sick, Badger. The High King Peter and the rest may have been men, but they were a different sort of man. This one is of the accursed Telmarines. He has hunted beasts for sport, haven't you now?" "Well, to tell you the truth, I have. But they weren't talking beasts." "It's all the same thing."
No. You know it isn't. You know very well that the beasts in Narnia nowadays are different, and are no more than the poor, dumb, witless creatures you'd find in Calormen or Telmar. They're smaller, too, They're far more different from us than the half-dwarfs are from you.
There was a great deal more talk, but it all ended with the agreement that Caspian should stay, and even the promise that, as soon as he was able to go out, he should be taken to see what Trumpkin called the others. For apparently in these wild parts all sorts of creatures from the old days of Narnia still lived on in hiding. Chapter 6. The People that Lived in Hiding. Now began the happiest times that Caspian had ever known. On a fine summer morning, when the dew lay on the grass, he set off with the badger and the two dwarfs up through the forest to a high saddle in the mountains, and down onto their sunny southern slopes, where one looked upon the green wolds of Archenland. "We'll go first to the three bulgy bears," said Trumpkin. They came into a glade of an old hollow oak tree covered with moss, and Truffle Hunter tapped with his paw 3 times on the trunk, and there was no answer. Then he tapped again, and a woolly sort of voice from inside said,
"Go away! It's not time to get up yet."
But when he tapped the 3rd time, there was a noise like a small earthquake from inside, and a sort of door opened, and out came 3 brown bears, very bulgy indeed, and blinking their little eyes. And when everything had been explained to them, which took a long time because they were so sleepy, they said, just as Truffle Hunter had said, that a son of Adam ought to be king of Narnia, and all kissed Caspian, very wet, snuffly kisses they were, and offered him some honey. Caspian did not really want honey without bread at that time in the morning, but he thought it polite to accept. It took him a long time afterwards to get unsticky. After that they went on till they came among tall beech trees, and Truffle Hunter called out,
"Patter-twig! Patter-twig! Patter-twig!"
And almost at once, bounding down from branch to branch till he was just above their heads, came the most magnificent red squirrel that Caspian had ever seen. He was far bigger than the ordinary dumb squirrels which he'd sometimes seen in the castle gardens. Indeed, he was nearly the size of a terrier, and the moment you looked in his face, you saw he could talk. Indeed, the difficulty was to get him to stop talking, for, like all squirrels, he was a chatterer. He welcomed Caspian at once, and asked if he would like a nut, and Caspian said thanks, he would. But as Patter-twig went bounding away to fetch it, Truffle Hunter whispered,
"Don't look. Look the other way. It's very bad manners among squirrels to watch anyone going to his store, or to look as if you wanted to know where it was."
Then Patter-twig came back with the nut, and Caspian ate it. And after that Patter-twig asked if he could take any messages to other friends. "For I can go nearly everywhere without setting foot to ground." Truffle Hunter and the dwarfs thought this a very good idea, and gave Patter-twig messages to all sorts of people with queer names, telling them all to come to a feast and council on Dancing Lawn at midnight, 3 nights ahead. "And we'd better tell the bulgy bears too. We forgot to mention it to them." Their next visit was to the 7 brothers of Shuddering Wood. Trumpkin led the way back to the saddle, and then down eastwards to the northern slope of the mountains, till they came to a very solemn place among rocks and fir trees. They went very quietly, and presently Caspian could feel the ground shake under his feet, as if someone were hammering down below. Trumpkin went to a flat stone about the size of a water-butt, and stamped on it with his foot. After a long pause, it was moved away by someone or something underneath, and there was a dark round hole with a good deal of heat and steam coming out of it, and in the middle of the hole the head of a dwarf, very like Trumpkin himself. There was a long talk here, and the dwarf seemed more suspicious than the squirrel or the bulgy bears had been, but in the end the whole party were invited to come down. Caspian found himself descending a dark stairway into the earth, but when he came to the bottom he saw firelight. It was the light of a furnace. The whole place was a smithy. A subterranean stream ran past on one side of it. 2 dwarfs were at the bellows, another was holding a piece of red-hot metal on the anvil with a pair of tongs, and a 4th was hammering it, and 2, wiping their horny little hands on a greasy cloth, were coming forward to meet the visitors. It took some time to satisfy them that Caspian was a friend and not an enemy, but when they did, they all cried, "Long live the king!" And their gifts were noble: mail shirts and helmets and swords for Caspian and Trumpkin and Knickerbrick. The Badger could have had the same if he'd liked, but he said he was a beast, he was, and if his claws and teeth could not keep his skin whole, it wasn't worth keeping. The workmanship of the arms was far finer than any Caspian had ever seen, and he gladly accepted the dwarf-made sword instead of his own, which looked in comparison as feeble as a toy and as clumsy as a stick. The 7 brothers, who were all red dwarfs, promised to come to the feast at Dancing Lawn. A little farther on, in a dry, rocky ravine, they reached the cave of 5 black dwarfs. They looked suspiciously at Caspian, but in the end the eldest of them said, "If he's against my raz, we'll have him for king." And the next oldest said, "Shall we go farther up for you, to the crags? There's an ogre or 2 and a hag. We could introduce you to them up there." "Certainly not," said Caspian.
"I should think not indeed," said Truffle Hunter. "We want none of that sort on our side."
Knickerbrick disagreed with this, but Trumpkin and the Badger overruled him. It gave Caspian a shock to realise that the horrible creatures out of the old stories, as well as the nice ones, had some descendants in Narnia still.
"We should not have Aslan for our friend if we brought in that rabble."
"Oh, Aslan, what matters much more is that you wouldn't have me."
"Do you believe in Aslan, Knickerbrick?"
"I'll believe in anyone or anything, but'll batter these cursed Telmarine barbarians to pieces, or drive them out of Narnia. Anyone or anything. Aslan or the White Witch. Do you understand?"
"Silence, silence! You do not know what you're saying. She was a worse enemy than Myraz and all his race."
"Not to dwarfs, she wasn't."
Their next visit was a pleasanter one. As they came lower down, the mountains opened out into a great glen of wooded gorge, with a swift river running at the bottom. The open places near the river's edge were a mass of foxgloves and wild roses, and the air was buzzing with bees. Here Truffle Hunter called again,
"Glenstorm! Glenstorm!"
And after a pause, Caspian heard the sound of hoofs. It grew louder, till the valley trembled, and at last, breaking and trampling the thickets, they came in sight of the noblest creatures that Caspian had ever seen, the great centaur Glenstorm and his 3 sons. His flanks were glossy chestnut, and the beard that covered his broad chest was a golden red. He was a prophet and a stargazer, and knew what they had come about.
"Long live the king! I and my sons are ready for war. When is the battle to be joined?"
Up till now, neither Caspian nor the others had really been thinking of a war. They had some vague idea, perhaps, of an occasional raid on some human farmstead, or attacking a party of hunters, if it ventured too far into these southern wilds. But in the main they had thought only of living to themselves in woods and caves, and building up an attempt at old Narnia in hiding. As soon as Glenstorm had spoken, everyone felt much more serious. "Do you mean a real war? To drive Myraz out of Narnia?"
"What else? Why else does your majesty go clad in mail and girt with sword?"
"Is it possible, Glenstorm?"
"The time is ripe. I watch the skies, Badger, for it is mine to watch, as it is yours to remember. Tarver and Alambil have met in the halls of high heaven, and on earth a son of Adam has come once more, and arisen to name and rule the creatures. The hour has struck. Our council at the Dancing Lawn must be a council of war."
He spoke in such a voice that neither Caspian nor the others hesitated for a moment. It now seemed to them quite possible that they might win a war, and quite certain that they must wage one. As it was now past the middle of the day, they rested with the centaurs and ate such food as the centaurs provided, cakes of oaten meal and apples and herbs and wine and cheese. The next place they were to visit was quite near at hand, but they had a long way to go round in order to avoid a region in which men lived. It was well into the afternoon before they found themselves in level fields, warm between hedgerows. There Truffle Hunter called at the mouth of a little hole in a green bank, and out popped the last thing Caspian expected, a talking mouse. He was, of course, bigger than a common mouse, well over a foot high when he stood on his hind legs, and with ears nearly as long as, though broader than, a rabbit's. His name was Reepy-Cheep, and he was a gay and martial mouse. He wore a tiny little rapier at his side, and twirled his long whiskers as if they were a moustache. "There are 12 of us, sire," he said, with a dashing and graceful bow, "and I place all the resources of my people unreservedly at your Majesty's disposal." Caspian tried hard and successfully not to laugh, but he couldn't help thinking that Reepy-Cheep and all his people could very easily be put in a washing basket and carried home on one's back. It would take too long to mention all the creatures whom Caspian met that day. Clodsy Shovel the mole, the 3 hard-biters, who were badgers like Truffle Hunter, Camillo the hare, and Hogglestock the hedgehog. They rested at last beside a well at the edge of a wide and level circle of grass, bordered with tall elms, which now threw long shadows across it, for the sun was setting, the daisies closing, and the rooks flying home to bed. Here they supped on food they had brought with them, and Trumpkin lit his pipe. Knickerbrick was not a smoker.
"Now, if only we could wake the spirits of these trees and this well, we should have done a good day's work."
"Can't we?"
"No, we have no powers over them. Since the humans came into the land, felling forests and defiling streams, the dryads and naiads have sunk into a deep sleep. Who knows if they will ever stir again? And that is a great loss to our side. Telmarines are horribly afraid of the woods, and once the trees moved in anger, our enemies would go mad with fright and be chased out of Narnia as quick as their legs could carry them."
"What imaginations you animals have," said Trumpkin, who didn't believe in such things.
"But why stop at trees and waters? Wouldn't it be even nicer if the stones started throwing themselves at old Myraz?"
The badger only grunted at this, and after that there was such a silence that Caspian had nearly dropped off to sleep, when he thought he heard a faint musical sound from the depths of the woods at his back. Then he thought it was only a dream, and turned over again. But as soon as his ear touched the ground, he felt, or heard, it was hard to tell which, a faint beating or drumming. He raised his head. The beating noise at once became fainter, but the music returned, clearer this time. It was like flutes. He saw that Truffle Hunter was sitting up, staring into the wood. The moon was bright. Caspian had been asleep longer than he thought. Nearer and nearer came the music, a tune wild yet dreamy, and the noise of many light feet, till at last, out from the wood into the moonlight, came dancing shapes such as Caspian had been thinking of all his life. They were not much taller than dwarfs, but far slighter and more graceful. Their curly heads had little horns, the upper parts of their bodies gleamed naked in the pale light, but their legs and feet were those of goats. "Fawns!" said Caspian, jumping up, and in a moment they were all round him. It took next to no time to explain the whole situation to them, and they accepted Caspian at once. Before he knew what he was doing, he found himself joining in the dance. Trumpkin, with heavier and jerkier movements, did likewise, and even Truffle Hunter hopped and lumbered about as best he could. Only Knickerbrick stayed where he was, looking on in silence. The fawns footed it all round Caspian to their reedy pipes. Their strange faces, which seemed mournful and merry all at once, looked into his. Dozens of fawns, Mentius and Abentius and Dumnus, Volans, Volintus, Geribus, Neminus, Nossus, and Oskans. Pattertwig had sent them all. When Caspian awoke next morning, he could hardly believe that it had not all been a dream, but the grass was covered with little cloven hoof marks. Chapter 7. Old Narnia in Danger. The place where they had met the fawns was, of course, Dancing Lawn itself, and here Caspian and his friends remained till the night of the great council. To sleep under the stars, to drink nothing but well water, and to live chiefly on nuts and wild fruit was a strange experience for Caspian, after his bed with silken sheets in a tapestried chamber at the castle, with meals laid out on gold and silver dishes in the anteroom, and attendants always ready at his call. But he had never enjoyed himself more. Never had sleep been more refreshing, nor food tasted more savoury, and he began already to harden, and his face wore a kinglier look. When the great night came, and his various strange subjects came stealing into the lawn by ones and twos and threes, or by sixes and sevens, the moon then shining almost at her full, his heart swelled as he saw their numbers and heard their greetings. All whom he had met were there, bulgy bears, red dwarfs, black dwarfs, moles and badgers, hares and hedgehogs, and others whom he had not yet seen. 5 satyrs as red as foxes, the whole contingent of talking mice armed to the teeth, and following a shrill trumpet, some owls, the old raven of Ravenscore, last of all, and this took Caspian's breath away. With the centaurs came a small but genuine giant, Wimbleweather of Dead Man's Hill, carrying on his back a basketful of rather seasick dwarfs who had accepted his offer of a lift, and were now wishing they had walked instead. The bulgy bears were very anxious to have the feast first and leave the council till afterwards, perhaps till tomorrow. Reepicheep and his mice said that councils and feasts could both wait, and proposed storming Myraz in his own castle that very night. Pattertwig and the other squirrels said that they could talk and eat at the same time, so why not have the council and feast all at once? The moles proposed throwing up entrenchments around the lawn before they did anything else, and the fawns thought it would be better to begin with a solemn dance. The old raven, while agreeing with the bears that it would take too long to have a full council before supper, begged to be allowed to give a brief address to the whole company. But Caspian and the centaurs and the dwarfs overruled all these suggestions, and insisted on holding a real council of war at once. When all the other creatures had been persuaded to sit down quietly in a great circle, and when, with more difficulty, they had got Pattertwig to stop running to and fro, and saying, "Silence! Silence, everyone, for the king's speech!" Caspian, feeling a little nervous, got up. "Narnians," he began, but he never got any further, for at that very moment Camillo the hare said, "Hush! There's a man somewhere near." They were all creatures of the wild, accustomed to being hunted, and they all became still as statues. The beasts all turned their noses in the direction which Camillo had indicated.
"Smells like man, and yet not quite like man," whispered Truffle Hunter.
"It's getting steadily nearer," said Camillo. "2 badgers, and you 3 dwarfs with your bows at the ready. Go softly off to meet it," said Caspian.
"We'll settle 'un,"
said a black dwarf grimly, fitting a shaft to his bowstring. "Don't shoot if it's alone. Catch it."
"Why?" "Do as you are told,"
said Glenstorm the centaur. Everyone waited in silence, while the 3 dwarfs and 2 badgers trotted stealthily across the trees to the northwest side of the lawn. Then came a sharp dwarfish cry.
"Stop! Who goes there?"
And a sudden spring. A moment later, a voice which Caspian knew well could be heard saying, all right, I'm unharmed. Take my wrists if you like, worthy badgers, but don't bite right through them. I want to speak to the king." "Dr. Cornelius!" Caspian rushed forward to greet his old tutor. Everyone else crowded round.
"Pah!" said Knickerbrick. "A renegade dwarf. A half and halfer. Shall I pass my sword through its throat?" "Be quiet, Knickerbrick. The creature can't help its ancestry."
"This is my greatest friend, and the saviour of my life, and anyone who doesn't like his company may leave my army at once." "Dearest doctor, I am glad to see you again. However did you find us out?" "By a little use of simple magic, your majesty," said the doctor, who was puffing and blowing from having walked so fast. "But there is no time to go into that now. We must all fly from this place at once. You are already betrayed, and Myraz is on the move. Before midday tomorrow you will be surrounded." "Betrayed? And by whom?"
"Another renegade dwarf, no doubt."
"By your horse, Destria."
The poor brute knew no better. When you were knocked off, of course, he went dawdling back to his stable in the castle. Then the secret of your flight was known. I made myself scarce, having no wish to be questioned about it in Myra's torture chamber. I had a pretty good guess from my crystal as to where I could find you. But all day, that was the day before yesterday, I saw Myra's tracking parties out in the woods. Yesterday I learned that his army is out. I don't think some of your pure-blooded dwarfs have as much woodcraft as might be expected. You've left tracks all over the place. Great carelessness. At any rate, something has warned Myraz that old Narnia is not so dead as he had hoped, and he is on the move.
"Hurrah!" said a very shrill and small voice from somewhere at the doctor's feet. "Let them come. All I ask is that the king will put me and my people in the front."
What on earth? Has your majesty got grasshoppers or mosquitoes in your army? Ah, by the lion, it is a mouse. Signor Mouse, I desire your better acquaintance. I am honoured by meeting so valiant a beast.
"My friendship you shall have, learned man, and any dwarf or giant in the army who does not give you good language shall have my sword to reckon with."
Is there time for this foolery? What are our plans? Battle or flight? Asked Knickerbrick. Battle if need be, said Trumpkin, but we are hardly ready for it yet, and this is no very defensible place.
"I don't like the idea of running away," said Caspian.
Hear him, said the bulgy bears. Whatever we do, don't let's have any running, especially not before supper, and not too soon after it either.
Those who run first do not always run last, said the centaur. And why should we let the enemy choose our position instead of choosing it ourselves? Let us find a strong place.
That's wise, your majesty, that's wise, said Truffle Hunter.
But where are we to go? Asked several voices.
Your majesty, said Dr. Cornelius, and all you variety of creatures,
I think we must fly east and down the river to the great woods. The Telmarines hate that region. They have always been afraid of the sea, and of something that may come over the sea. That is why they have let the great woods grow up. If traditions speak true, the ancient Cair Paravel was at the river mouth. All that part is friendly to us and hateful to our enemies. We must go to Aslan's How.
Aslan's How? Said several voices.
We do not know what that is.
It lies within the skirts of the great woods, and it is a huge mound which Narnians raised in very ancient times over a very magical place, where there stood, and perhaps still stands, a very magical stone. The mound is all hollowed out within into galleries and caves, and the stone is in the central cave of all. There is room in the mound for all our stores, and those of us who have most need of cover and are most accustomed to being underground can be lodged in the caves. The rest of us can lie in the wood. At a pinch, all of us, except this worthy giant, could retreat into the mound itself, and there we should be beyond the reach of every danger, except famine. It is a good thing we have a learned man amongst us. Soup and celery! I wish our leaders would think less about old wives' tales and more about victuals and arms.
But all approved of Cornelius's proposal, and that very night, half an hour later, they were on the march. Before sunrise they arrived at Aslan's How. It was certainly an awesome place, a round green hill on top of another hill, long since grown over with trees, and one little low doorway leading into it. The tunnels inside were a perfect maze till you got to know them, and they were lined and roofed with smooth stones, and on the stones, peering in the twilight, Caspian saw strange characters and snaky patterns, and pictures in which the form of a lion was repeated again and again. It all seemed to belong to an even older Narnia than the Narnia of which his nurse had told him. It was after they had taken up their quarters in and around the How that fortune began to turn against them. King Myras' scouts soon found their new lair, and he and his army arrived on the edge of the woods. And as so often happens, the enemy turned out stronger than they had reckoned. Caspian's heart sank as he saw the company after company arriving, And though Myraz's men may have been afraid of going into the woods, they were even more afraid of Myraz, and with him in command they carried battle deeply into it, and sometimes almost to the How itself. Caspian and other captains, of course, made many sorties into the open country. Thus there was fighting on most days, and sometimes by night as well. But Caspian's party had, on the whole, the worst of it. At last there came a night when everything had gone as badly as possible, and the rain which had been falling heavily all day had ceased at nightfall, only to give place to raw cold. That morning Caspian had arranged what was his biggest battle yet, and all had hung their hopes on it. He, with most of the dwarfs, was to have fallen on the king's right wing at daybreak, and then, when they were heavily engaged, giant Wimbleweather, with the centaurs and some of the fiercest beasts, was to have broken out from another place and endeavoured to cut the king's right off from the rest of the army. But it had all failed. No one had warned Caspian, because no one in these later days of Narnia remembered that giants are not at all clever. Poor Wimbleweather, though as brave as a lion, was a true giant in that respect. He had broken out at the wrong time and from the wrong place, and both his party and Caspian's had suffered badly and done the enemy little harm. The best of the bears had been hurt, a centaur terribly wounded, and there were few in Caspian's party who had not lost blood. It was a gloomy company that huddled down under the dripping trees to eat their scanty supper. The gloomiest of all was giant Wimbleweather. He knew it was all his fault. He sat in silence, shedding big tears which collected on the end of his nose and then fell off with a huge splash on the whole bivouac of the mice, who had just been beginning to get warm and drowsy. They all jumped up, shaking the water out of their ears and wringing their little blankets, and asked the giant, in shrill but forcible voices, whether he thought they weren't wet enough without this sort of thing. And then other people woke up and told the mice they had been enrolled as scouts and not as a concert party, and asked why they couldn't keep quiet. And Wimbleweather tiptoed away to find some place where he could be miserable in peace, and stepped on somebody's tail, and somebody, they said afterwards it was a fox, bit him. And so everyone was out of temper. But in the secret and magical chamber at the heart of the How, King Caspian, with Cornelius and the Badger and Nickabrick and Trumpkin, were at council. Thick pillars of ancient workmanship supported the roof. In the centre was the stone itself, a stone table, split right down the centre and covered with what had once been writing of some kind, but ages of wind and rain and snow had almost worn them away in old times when the stone table had stood on the hilltop, and the mound had not yet been built above it. They were not using the table, nor sitting round it. It was too magic a thing for any common use. They sat on logs a little way from it, and between them was a rough wooden table, on which stood a rude clay lamp, lighting up their pale faces and throwing big shadows on the walls.
"If your Majesty is ever to use the horn, I think the time has now come."
Caspian had, of course, told them of its treasure several days ago. "We are certainly in great need, but it's hard to be sure we are at our greatest. Supposing there came an even worse need and we'd already used it?"
"By that argument, your Majesty'll never use it till it's too late."
"I agree with that. What do you think, Trumpkin?"
"Oh, as for me, your Majesty knows. I think the horn, and that bit of broken stone over there, and your great King Peter and your lion Aslan, are all eggs in moonshine. It's all one to me when your Majesty blows the horn. All I insist on is that the army is told nothing about it. There's no good raising hopes of magical help which, as I think, are sure to be disappointed." "Then in the name of Aslan, we will wind Queen Susan's horn." "There is one thing, sire,
that should perhaps be done first. We do not know what force the help may take. It might call Aslan himself from oversea, but I think it more likely to call Peter the High King and his mighty consorts down from the high past. But in either case, I do not think we can be sure that the help will come to this very spot."
"You never said a truer word,"
put in Trumpkin. "I think that they, or he, will come back to one of the other ancient places of Narnia. This, where we now sit, is the most ancient and most deeply magical of all, and here I think the answer is likeliest to come. But there are two others. One is Lantern Waste upriver west of Beaver's Dam, where the royal children first appeared in Narnia, as the records tell. The other is down at the river mouth, where their castle of Cape Harrival once stood. But if Aslan himself comes, that would be the best place for meeting him too, for every story says that he is the son of the great emperor over the sea, and over the sea he will pass. I should like very much to send messengers to both places, to Lantern Waste and the river mouth, to receive them, or him, or it. Just as I thought. The first result of all this foolery is not to bring us help, but to lose us 2 fighters. Who would you think of sending, Dr. Cornelius?
Squirrels are best for getting through enemy country without being caught.
All our squirrels, and we haven't many, said Knickerbrick, are rather flighty. The only one I'd trust on a job like that would be Pattertwig.
Let it be Pattertwig, then. And who for our other messenger? I know you'd go, Truffle Hunter, but you haven't the speed. Nor you, Dr. Cornelius.
I won't go. With all these humans and beasts about, there must be a dwarf here to see that the dwarfs are fairly treated.
Thimbles and thunderstorms. Is that how you speak to the king? Send me, sire. I'll go.
But I thought you didn't believe in the Horn Trumpkin.
No more I do, your majesty, but what's that got to do with it?
I might as well die on a wild goose chase as die here. You are my king. I know the difference between giving advice and taking orders. You've had my advice, and now it's the time for orders.
I will never forget this, Trumpkin. Send for Pattertwig, one of you. And when shall I blow the horn? I would wait for sunrise, your majesty. That sometimes has an effect in operations of white magic. A few minutes later, Pattertwig arrived, and had his task explained to him. As he was, like many squirrels, full of courage and dash, and energy and excitement and mischief, not to say conceit, he no sooner heard it than he was eager to be off. It was arranged that he should run for Lantern Waste, while Trumpkin made the shorter journey to the river mouth. After a hasty meal they both set off, with the fervent thanks and good wishes of the king, the badger, and Cornelius. Chapter 8. How they left the island.
And so, said Trumpkin, for, as you have realized, it was he who had been telling all this story to the 4 children, sitting on the grass in the ruined hall of Cape Harrival. And so I put a crust or 2 in my pocket, left behind all weapons but my dagger, and took to the woods in the grey of the morning. I'd been plugging away for many hours, when there came a sound that I'd never heard the like of in my born days. I won't forget that. The whole air was full of it, loud as thunder, but far longer, cool and sweet as music over water, but strong enough to shake the woods. And I said to myself, if that's not the horn, call me a rabbit. And a moment later, I wondered why he hadn't blown it sooner. What time was it? Asked Edmund. Between 9 and 10 o'clock. Just when we were at the railway station, said all the children, and looked at each other with shining eyes. Please go on, said Lucy to the dwarf. Well, as I was saying, I wondered, but I went on as hard as I could pelt. I kept on all night, and then, when it was half light this morning, as if I'd no more sense than a giant, I risked a short cut across open country to cut off a big loop of a river, and was caught. Not by the army, but by a pompous old fool who has charge of a little castle which is Myra's last stronghold towards the coast. I needn't tell you they got no true tale out of me, but I was a dwarf, and that was enough. But lobsters and lollipops, it's a good thing the seneschal was a pompous fool. Anyone else would have run me through there and then, but nothing would do for him short of a grand execution, sending me down to the ghosts in the full ceremonial way. And then this young lady, he nodded at Susan, does a bit of archery, and it was pretty shooting, let me tell you, and here we are, and without my armour, for of course they took that. He knocked out and refilled his pipe. Great Scott, said Peter. So it was the horn, your own horn, Sue, that dragged us off that seat on the platform yesterday morning. I can hardly believe it, yet it all fits in. I don't know why you shouldn't believe it, said Lucy.
if you believe in magic at all. Aren't there lots of stories about magic forcing people out of one world into another? I mean, when a magician in the Arabian Nights calls up a djinn, it has to come. We had to come, just like that. Yes. I suppose what makes it feel so queer is that in the stories it's always someone in our world who does the calling. One doesn't really think about where the djinn's coming from. And now we know what it feels like for the djinn, said Edmund with a chuckle. Golly, it's a bit uncomfortable to know that we can be whistled for like that. It's worse than what Father says about living at the mercy of the telephone. But we want to be here, don't we, if Aslan wants us? Meanwhile, what are we to do? I suppose I'd better go back to King Caspian and tell him no help has come. No help, said Susan. But it has worked. Here we are. Yes, well, to be sure. I see that, said the dwarf, whose pipe seemed to be blocked. At any rate, he made himself very busy cleaning it. But, well, I mean... But don't you see who we are? Shouted Lucy. You are stupid. I suppose you're the four children out of the old stories, and I'm very glad to meet you, of course, and it's very interesting, no doubt. But, no offence. Do get on and say whatever you're going to say, said Edmund. Well then, no offence. But you know, the King and Truffle Hunter and Dr. Cornelius were expecting, well, if you see what I mean, help. To put it another way, I think they'd been imagining you as great warriors. As it is, we're awfully fond of children and all that, but just at the moment in the middle of a war, I'm quite sure you understand. You mean you think we're no good? Oh, now, pray don't be offended. I assure you, my dear little friends, little from you, that's a bit too much, said Edmund. I suppose you don't believe we won the Battle of Baruna? Well, you can say what you like about me, because I know there's no good losing our tempers, said Peter. Let's fit him out with fresh armour, and fit ourselves out from the treasure chamber, and have a talk after that. I don't quite see the point, began Edmund, but Lucy whispered in his ear, Hadn't we better do what Peter says? He is the High King, you know. I think he has an idea. So Edmund agreed, and by the aid of his talks they all, including Trumpkin, went down the steps again into the dark coldness and dusty splendour of the treasure house. The dwarf's eyes glistened as he saw the wealth that lay on the shelves, though he had to stand on tiptoes to do so. It would never do to let Nickabrick see this. Never! They found, easily enough, a mail shirt for him, a sword, a helmet, a shield, a bow and a quiver full of arrows, all of dwarfish size. The helmet was of copper set with rubies, and there was gold on the hilt of the sword. Trumpkin had never seen, much less carried, so much wealth in all his life. The children also put on mail shirts and helmets. A sword and shield were found for Edmund, and a bow for Lucy. Peter and Susan were, of course, already carrying their gifts. As they came back up the stairway, jingling in their mail, and already looking and feeling more like Narnians and less like schoolchildren, the two boys were behind, apparently making some plan. Lucy heard Edmund say, No, let me do it. It'll be more of a sucks for him if I win, and less of a let-down for us if I all fail. All right, Ed. When they came into the daylight, Edmund turned to the dwarf and said very politely, I've got something to ask you. Kids like us, well, we don't often have the chance of meeting a great warrior like you. Would you mind a little fencing match with me? It'll be frightfully decent. But, lad, these swords are sharp. I know, but I'll never get anywhere near you, and you'll be quite clever enough to disarm me without doing any real damage. It's a dangerous game, but since you make such a point of it, I'll try a pass or two. Both swords were out in a moment, and the three others jumped off the dais and stood watching. It was well worth it. It was not like the silly fighting you see with broadswords on the stage. It was not even like the rapier fighting, which you sometimes see, rather better done. This was real broadsword fighting. The great thing is to slash at your enemy's legs and feet, because they are the part that have no armour. And when he slashes at yours, you jump with both feet off the ground so that his blow goes under them. This gave the dwarf an advantage, because Edmund, being much taller, had always to be stooping. I don't think Edmund would have had a chance if he had fought Trumpkin 24 hours earlier. but the air of Narnia had been working upon him ever since they arrived on the island, and all his old battles came back to him, and his arms and fingers remembered their old skill. He was King Edmund once more. Round and round the two combatants circled, stroke after stroke they gave, and Susan, who never could learn to like this sort of thing, shouted out, "Oh, do be careful!" And then, so quickly that no one, unless they knew, as Peter did, could quite see how it happened, Edmund flashed his sword round with a peculiar twist. The dwarf's sword flew out of his grip, and Trumpkin was wringing his empty hand as you do after a sting from a cricket bat. "Not hurt, I hope, my dear little friend?" said Edmund, panting a little and returning his own sword to its sheath.
"I see the point. You know a trick I never learned."
"Well, that's quite true," put in Peter. "The best swordsman in the world may be disarmed by a trick that's new to him. I think it's only fair to give Trumpkin a chance at something else. Will you have a shooting match with my sister? There are no tricks in archery, you know."
"Oh, jokers you are. I begin to see. As if I didn't know how she can shoot after what happened this morning. All the same, I'll have a try."
He spoke gruffly, but his eyes brightened, for he was a famous bowman among his own people. All 5 of them came out into the courtyard.
"What's to be the target?"
"I think that apple hanging over the wall on the branch should do," said Susan.
"That'll do nicely, lass," said Trumpkin. "You mean the yellow one near the middle of that arch?"
"No, not that. The red one up above, over the battlement." The dwarf's face fell.
"Looks more like a cherry than an apple."
But he said nothing out loud. They tossed up for the first shot, greatly to the interest of Trumpkin, who'd never seen a coin tossed before, and Susan lost. They were to shoot from the top of the steps that led from the hall into the courtyard. Everyone could see from the way the dwarf took his position and handled the bow that he knew what he was about. Twang went the string. It was an excellent shot. The tiny apple shook as the arrow passed, and a leaf came fluttering down. Then Susan went to the top of the steps and strung her bow. She was not enjoying herself half as much as Edmund had enjoyed his, not because she had felt any doubt about hitting the apple, but because Susan was so tender-hearted that she almost hated to beat someone who had been beaten already. The dwarf watched her keenly as she drew the shaft to her ear. A moment later, with a little soft thump, which they could all hear in that quiet place, the apple fell to the grass, with Susan's arrow in it. "Oh, well done, Sue!" shouted the other children. "It wasn't really any better than yours," said Susan. "I think there was a tiny breath of wind as you shot."
"No, there wasn't. Don't tell me. I know when I'm fairly beaten. I won't even say that the scar of my last wound catches me a bit when I get my arm well back."
"Are you wounded?" asked Lucy. "Do let me look."
"It's not a sight for little girls. Ah, there I go, talking like a fool again. I suppose you're as likely to be a great surgeon as your brother was a great swordsman, or your sister a great archer."
He sat down on the steps and took off his hauberk and slipped down his little shirt, showing an arm as hairy and muscular in proportion as a sailor's, though not much bigger than a child's. There was a clumsy bandage on the shoulder, which Lucy proceeded to unroll. Underneath, the cut looked very nasty, and there was a good deal of swelling. "Oh, poor Trumpkin, how horrid!" Then she carefully dripped onto it one single drop of the cordial from her flask.
"Hello, what have you done?"
But however Trumpkin turned his head and squinted and whisked his beard to and fro, he couldn't quite see his own shoulder. Then he felt it as well as he could, getting his arms and fingers into very difficult positions, as you do when you're trying to scratch a place that's just out of reach. Then he swung his arm and raised it and tried the muscles, and finally jumped to his feet.
"Giants and junipers! It's cured! It's as good as new!"
After that he burst into a great laugh.
"Well, I've made a bigger fool of myself as ever a dwarf did. No offence, I hope. My humble duty to your majesties all. Humble duty. And thanks for my life, my cure, my breakfast, and my lesson."
The children all said it was quite all right and not to mention it. "And now," said Peter, "if you've really decided to believe in us—"
"I have."
"It's quite clear what we must do. We must join King Caspian at once."
"The sooner the better. My being such a fool has already wasted about an hour.
It's about 2 days' journey for where you came. For us, I mean. We can't walk all day and night like you dwarfs. What Trumpkin calls Aslan's How is obviously the stone table itself. You remember it was about half a day's march, or a little less, from down by the fords of Baruna.
Baruna's Bridge, we call it.
Oh, there was no bridge in our time. And then from Baruna down to here was another day and a bit. We used to get home about tea time on the second day, going easily. Going hard, we could perhaps do the whole thing in a day and a half, perhaps.
But remember, it's all woods now, and there are enemies to dodge.
Look here, said Edmund. Need we go by the same way our dear little friend came?
No more of that, your Majesty, if you love me.
Very well. May I say our DLF? Oh, Edmund, don't keep on at him like that.
That's quite all right, lass. Oh, I mean, your Majesty. A jibe won't raise a blister.
After that, they often called him the DLF, till they'd almost forgotten what it meant. As I was saying, continued Edmund, we needn't go that way. Why shouldn't we row a little south till we come to Glasswater Creek, and row up it? That brings us behind the hill of a stone table, and we'll be safe while we're at sea. If we start at once, we can be at the head of the Glasswater before dark, get a few hours' sleep, and be with Caspian pretty early tomorrow.
Oh, what a thing it is to know the coast. None of us know anything about Glasswater.
What about food? Oh, we've got some apples still. Do let's get on. We've done nothing yet. We've been here nearly 2 days. And anyway, no one's going to have my hat for a fish basket again. They used one of the raincoats as a kind of bag and put a good many apples in it. Then they all had a good long drink at the well, for they would meet no more fresh water till they landed at the head of a creek and went down to the boat. The children were sorry to leave Cape Haravel, which even in ruins had begun to feel like home again. The DLF had better steer, said Peter, and Ed and I will take an oar each. Half a moment, though. We'd better take off our mail. We're going to be pretty warm before we're done. The girls had better be in the bows and shout directions to the DLF, because he doesn't know the way. You'd better get us a fair way out to sea till we've passed the island. And soon the green, wooded coast of the island was falling away behind them, and its little bays and headlands were beginning to look flatter, and the boat was rising and falling in the gentle swell. The sea began to grow bigger around them, and in the distance, bluer, but close about the boat, it was green and bubbly. Everything smelled salt, and there was no noise except the swishing of water and the clop-clop of water against the sides of the splash of the oars, and the clop-clop of water against the sides, and the splash of the oars, and the jolting noise of the rowlocks. The sun grew hot. It was delightful for Lucy and Susan in the bows, bending over the edge and trying to get their hands in the sea, which they could never quite reach. The bottom, mostly pure, pale sand, but with occasional patches of purple seaweed, could be seen beneath them. "It's like old times," said Lucy. "Do you remember our voyage to Terabithia, and Galma, and Seven Isles, and the Lone Islands?" "Yes, and our great ship, the Splendor Hyaline, with the swan's head at her prow, and the carved swan's wings coming back almost to her waist, the silken sails, and the great stern lanterns, and the feasts on the poop, and the musicians. Do you remember when we had the musicians up in the rigging, playing flutes so it sounded like music out of the sky?" Presently Susan took over Edmund's oar, and he came forward to join Lucy. They had passed the island now, and stood closer to the shore, all wooded and deserted. They would have thought it very pretty, if they had not remembered the time when it was open and breezy, and full of merry friends. "Oh, this is pretty gruelling work," said Peter. "Can't I row for a bit?" said Lucy. "The oars are too big for you," said Peter shortly, not because he was cross, but because he had no strength to spare for talking.